This is now part 2 of lecture 14 of Applied Machine Learning, and in this video I will talk about artificial neural networks. In the previous video we defined a model for a single artificial neuron, and now we are going to see how to combine these neurons into a more complex model called the artificial neural networks. So recall that in our previous video we defined this model in which we have a neuron that has the following form. We take an input x and we modulate each dimension of x with a weight, with a multiplicative weight w. Then we sum this, we sum the modulated inputs, and then this goes into an activation function which typically outputs a larger value when this input is large and a smaller value when it is small. And in that sense, it models the behavior of a biological neuron. Two well-known examples of artificial neurons are the perceptron, and also logistic regression can be viewed as an idealized model of an artificial neuron. So in this video, we're going to see how to combine neurons into neural networks. And the way this is typically done is via neural network layers. So here, this image illustrates best what a neural network looks like. Each node here, except for the red ones, but the blue and the green nodes are examples of neurons, and the red denotes the inputs. So here, the two red circles would contain the inputs x1. It would contain our two-dimensional input. So x1, the first dimension of x, x2, the second dimension of x, and then these are fed. Both of these are fed into the first neuron, the second neuron, the third neuron. Each of these neurons can have different weights. Then the output of these neurons gets fed into a last neuron, and this is the output of our network. And we can think of these arrows as, well, first of all, within each arrow, for each arrow we have an associated weight, and these correspond to, well, for this neuron, its input arrows correspond to dendrites, and the red circles correspond to the input signals that get received via these dendrites. Then the blue circle behaves like the body of a cell, which takes the weighted sum of all the inputs, and then it applies an activation function to determine how the neuron is going to fire, and then the output gets sent via this axon into the next neuron. So in this sense, this is a model of an artificial neural. This is an artificial neural network, a model of what could be a biological neural network. And what's important here is that this is typically represented as a directed acyclic graph, although there is such a thing as recurrent neural networks, but we're not going to see this we're not going to look at this in this video or in this lecture. But most often the standard type of neural network is directed, meaning that the input signals are propagated forward and modified by these neurons until they reach an output. And they're typically organized in layers, which means that these inputs don't communicate with each other. And in principle they could, but arranging them in layers makes computation easier, and it also makes it easier to define these operations in terms of linear algebra. So more formally, we can define a neural network layer as a function that takes a d-dimensional input and outputs a p-dimensional output. And what it does is to apply a number p of neurons in parallel to the input x. And each neuron has its own weight, and typically they share the same activation function, although strictly speaking, we could in principle have a layer with different activation functions, but typically these are the same. And the total set of parameters of this layer is the union of all the parameters of all the neurons. And we refer to P as the size of the layer, which is again the number of neurons. We can visualize it as follows. Here our input is X, and in this example it is two-dimensional. This neuron has a weight W1, which is also two-dimensional. It multiplies the input coming in via these two arrows. Then these get summed, and the output is given by sigma. The same thing is, we have the same thing for the second neuron and for the third neuron as well. And in this layer, we have the following weights: W1, W2, W3. It is easier often to put these to combine these weights into a matrix. So here W is simply the matrix in which each row is the vector Wi transpose. So Wi transpose is the ith row of W, and so we can write this layer as using linear algebra notation by doing a matrix vector product, which gives us a vector that has these elements but without the activation function, and then we apply this activation function to this vector, which just means that we apply it to each element. So this is a bit of notation to make things more succinct. And if we actually implement this, if we use linear algebra libraries to implement it in this way, it will make things much faster. And graphically, we can represent this as follows. Here, this entire layer has a set of parameters that are denoted by a matrix W, and the output is simply sigma W times X. So I have defined a layer. Now I can define more formally a neural network. And a neural network is simply a composition of a number of layers, let's say L layers. And by the way, we refer to the inner layers as hidden layers, and the output is the output layer. And they're hidden because, well, we do not see their output directly. It gets fed into another internal layer. And assuming we are predicting a Y that is either a standard regression target or a classification target, the final layer will have a one-dimensional output. And it may also not use any activation function, or it may require a special activation function that depends on the output that we want to predict. And this notation here with a circle, if you haven't seen it, it just denotes the composition of function. So f circle g simply means f of g. So we are composing these functions one into another. And visually, we can represent this as follows. Here we have the inputs, which go into a hidden layer, and then we have potentially a long sequence of these kinds of hidden layers until we reach our final output layer. So we can implement this quite easily in Python. Suppose that we have a simple neural network with a two-dimensional input, 3 hidden units, so 3 hidden neurons, or one hidden layer of size 3, and then a final output layer. We can implement this in Python quite easily. Here we simply define a random matrix for W. We start with a random matrix for V. And then if we wanted to, we also define an activation function. Here, this is the sigmoid activation function. And if we want to compute the output, we receive an X. Here we compute the output of the final layer of the hidden layer. And here we compute the output of the output layer. And this is just a really simple implementation of a neural network, and we're using NumPy to perform these linear algebra operations efficiently. We're going to pause here, and in the next lecture we will actually see how to train this model using gradient descent. Now, before I move on, I also want to mention that there are many other output layers. Here, so far I have mentioned these 3 types, but there are actually many other ones. We use the term dense layer to denote the kinds of layers that we have seen before, where we have a matrix operation and every neuron from the previous layer is connected to every neuron in the following layer. But in practice, many useful layers do not have these dense connections, or if they do, they reuse parameters across them. One very important type of layer that we're going to see in the next lecture is the convolutional layer, which applies, so this multiplication is such that we apply a special operation called the convolution, which I'm going to define in the next lecture. And sometimes, as I mentioned, these layers can feed back into earlier layers, which breaks the DAG structure, but then we have something called a recurrent neural network. So to summarize, I have defined a new algorithm called a neural network, and the examples that I gave, they were fully connected, again, because they all used dense layers, and there are other types of neural networks which do not use these fully connected layers, and we will see a few examples later on. But essentially, these are, again, algorithms for supervised learning, both regression and classification, and they are optimized using gradient descent. These kinds of neural networks, even though the particular form that I described is typically not the kind of model that gives state-of-the-art result on interesting problems like image classification or recognition, they still work very well, and they are very flexible models. In fact, there are results that can show that a neural network that's sufficiently large can approximate any function. That's a famous theoretical result from the late 80s. And in terms of applications, these kinds of neural networks work best in domains where we have unstructured inputs such as audio or images, and it's not obvious how to manually define features for an image, and a neural network is useful in these kinds of applications. And again, for large enough neural networks, we can often get really good performance. Now, they also have limitations. They require a lot of data, and they can also be slow and also hard to train using gradient descent. By hard, I mean that we need to worry about carefully choosing the learning rate. We need to carefully choose the initial guess for the values of the parameters. We need to process our input, so the input has to be normalized. If some of the features are really large and some of them are really small, then it will not train well. The gradients will cause numerical instabilities, and it will actually not work. And it's also not, when it does not work, it's actually quite hard to debug. So neural networks have some limitations, but they're still a very important and a very powerful model.